The question on Question Time about David Cameron was very interesting, particularly the comment from the member of the audience, and I think probably...
You think Rishi Sunak just couldn't find anyone else?
I think it's difficult to find, ministers with enough experience to run a big department or to run something as complicated as foreign policy. Rishi Sunak is, someone who likes to get into all the details, and you just can't do that when you're the Prime Minister. So I think that was probably an aspect of it. And if Cameron's return, helps to smooth government, then that would be a good thing. But I think on Suella, I think that she had to go because she was repeatedly derailing government. Even though I agree with some of what she was trying to do, the way she presented it and the way she caused chaos was just untenable in the end.
OK, man here.
Well, you're making him a lord.
David Cameron.
David Cameron. Does his money go up a band? His wages?
No. He gets paid as Foreign Secretary, but he doesn't get paid as a lord. And peers who are ministers do not get the attendance allowance that other peers get.
There you are. There's an answer to your question. Let's hear from the man there in the check shirt.
I think the question for me is what actually is the hidden agenda. I can't imagine David Cameron's come back just for a year until the next election. It feels to me as if there is something more beyond that.
What, you think he's on a promise? You think he's on a promise?
Who knows? Who knows in Westminster who says what to whom? But I wouldn't like to comment on that. But I do think if the Conservatives face an overwhelming defeat, you could see him back as leader of the Conservative Party.
Is that something you would welcome?
I've always found him very relatable. I mean, I know his background's similar to Jacob there, but I've always thought he's really relatable for one reason, which is actually he suffered personal tragedy in his life, and I think that makes him more relatable than most.
The death of his son.
Yeah.
And David Cameron has come back into politics. It's something that Rory Stewart has suggested is a good thing. Not necessarily David Cameron himself, and Rory Stewart points out the many failings of David Cameron, but the idea that the ministers that we use in the cabinet, or we assemble around the cabinet's table, are not drawn solely from this incredibly small pool of incestuous MPs who are all in it for their own gain. The idea of people being brought in as ministers from outside this parliamentary cesspit, certainly from outside the Commons, is incredibly refreshing, and that they are brought in to serve the country. That's something I think that would be very interesting to see how that develops, and whether or not the Speaker of the House of Commons is bound to now look into ways to make David Cameron accountable and to answer questions in the House, although he is not a member of the House of Commons. There will be a formula which I suspect will be devised, maybe answering questions in Westminster Hall or something, and that formula could then be extended to a possibility that somebody who is not even a member of Parliament could become a minister, a senior minister in the next British government, in a Labour government, for example. David Cameron, what's his background? The real problem is the dodginess of his links with China. So he was a New York professor. He was the president of the Alzheimer research organisation in the UK, but it's his Chinese links that are questionable. Now, it's the way those Chinese links panned out, rather than, I think, his interest in China and his positivity towards China, which must be commended, and the Chinese are very positive about his appointment, of course. He aimed at dialogue. He aimed at a golden era between London and Beijing. And over the period since his quitting office as Prime Minister, he's undertaken several high-ranking trips to China, dinner with the President, dinner with the Premier, and even this year, launching deals with Sri Lanka, still ongoing, I believe. although Cameron has now withdrawn from all his business financial interests. And I think although Mrs. May and now Sunak have distanced themselves from Beijing, I think it's worth another look. I think it's worth trying to build bridges rather than dismantle them. And although in so many ways Cameron shows a certain naivety, a certain lack of experience, he also has the statesmanship and the gravitas to forge relationships which are beyond the ordinary Joe in the street and certainly beyond the ordinary minister. So I hope in the short time that's available to him, whether he becomes leader of the opposition or not, and the Speaker of the House of Commons would have to find some extraordinarily inventive ways of engineering PMQs if Cameron were to become leader of the Conservative Party after the general election. But it's not an impossibility. These things are there to be developed and problems to be solved. But I think in the short time that he's got, we could see a revival of our relationships with China. We could see Cameron using his extraordinary influence in the Middle East, maybe even in Russia and Beijing. Russia and Ukraine. But Cameron is not the only ex-Prime Minister who can be of service. And that's really the point. And that's the point that I think has slightly eluded Rishi Sunak. Because there's no reason why the Foreign Minister, should he take a job in the cabinet, there's no reason why he has to be even in the same party as the Prime Minister. I think at this particular moment, given Blair's great interest in the Middle East, Blair should be on a plane at our behest to put forward proposals to try to seek peace in the Middle East, to try to sort out some of the problems and drive home a peace solution that will work in the long term. And yes, this is one of the things that that the Mayor of London has said. This isn't simply an abstract interest. This is something where family relatives and friends known to people in this country, close relatives, have died in Israel, close relatives have died in Gaza. And friends, families have had their lives thrown into disarray. They are in danger. Their safety is uncertain in both Gaza and in Israel. And we need the expertise of those people who have worked in the field, who have worked in this area. Blair is one of them. Cameron's work is perhaps not so specific, but I think a combination of Cameron, of Blair, and of Major, these are people of towering importance in our country, simply because of the position that they held and the time that has passed since they were in office. I think the same thing cannot be said about Boris, and certainly cannot be said about May and Liz Truss. In fact, Liz Truss, the more she keeps quiet, the better and the safer the world will be. She is, after all, if you remember, almost single-handedly responsible for irritating Putin and for demonstrating her complete failure to master her brief, or at least to master a geography class, and to know that Rostov-on-Don is part of Russia, not part of Ukraine. So anyone other than Liz Truss, but certainly Blair and certainly Cameron, have a job to play in sorting out issues now, and Sunak's appointment of Cameron opens the door to greater possibilities of statesmen who may have got it right, may have got it partially wrong, but who can be brought back to have a second chance because they have that experience and that distance from office to be able to look at things again. And that is something that I think America uses, we don't use, and it is to our discredit that we don't use it.